Our next speaker is Dr. Mike Paustian. Many of you know Mike through working with the Iowa pork producers, but Mike is a sixth-generation farmer from Scott County, where he and his family operate a farrow-to-finish hog operation and grow corn, soybeans, and rye. Mike actually received his PhD in microbiology and worked as a research scientist before returning back to the family farm. And Mike is the past president of the Iowa Pork Producers Association. And Mike this year is also serving as our Christian lecture speaker this year. So this is our second year that we're doing this as part of our program. And so we're really thrilled to have Mike on stage today, and we look forward to a great conversation on gene editing. So with that, welcome, Mike.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Greiner. I guess first off, I should say, I'm very pleased to be here speaking. I have a lot of respect for the legacy of Dr. Christian. I won't claim to have much in common with him. I mean, he obviously has had a huge impact on the industry, other than the fact that we're both farm kids who turned into science nerds somewhere along the way. So I think most people are probably very familiar with Dr. Christian's work. If you aren't, look into it. I think I see, a lot of the things that he did, especially looking at porcine stress syndrome and trying to figure all that out with the tools he had available at the time it's an awesome story. And it's kind of interesting to look for parallels in that work with what we're trying to do today in genetics. And so that's what we'll get into a little bit today. I couldn't have asked for a better lead-in presentation before this, talking about innovation, right? And at the very end there, the question of, well, how do you go from innovation to getting a product to market? Right, and that becomes very hard, and that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today with gene editing. Here we have this innovative technology. It's been around for a while, but a lot of us are hearing about it for the first time now because we're finally getting products to market. And we as an industry need to decide, is this an innovation that we want to utilize in our industry? So why should you care what I think about any of this? Well, I guess I can kind of look at it from both angles. Since I am a recovering science nerd, I've enrolled in a 12-step program. It's been 17 years since I set up my last PCR reaction, so I'm on the way to sobriety. But I kind of have been very engaged in this topic because I understand the science behind it, and I also understand the potential impact that could have on my farm and a lot of other farms. So that's why I've been spending a lot of time talking with other people about this. I think for the past 8 years, probably, I've been going to meetings and talking to folks about this. And I think what it kind of boils down to is, as producers, we make a business decision about whether or not we're going to adopt new technologies on our farms, right? We do this every day, every year. We're constantly evaluating, is this going to give me a return on the investment, right? But things have changed, right? 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we didn't have to explain to our customers why we were doing the things that we did on the farm. It's a whole different world now, right? Now we have to be able to justify what we're doing and the changes we're making on our farms to our consumers and customers, right? And so now we're in a position where if we want to adopt new innovations, we have to be able to explain to others why that's a good thing for us and why that can be a good thing for them too. And the way I look at gene editing is potentially another tool in the toolbox, right? We already have a toolbox that's got a lot of great tools that we've successfully used to address challenges in the industry. And so really the question is not, is gene editing going to be this magical thing that just solves all of our problems? It's not, okay? I'll just be straight with you on that right now. But could it be another tool in the toolbox that we reach for when our other tools can't solve the problem we're trying to address. So that's kind of how I want you to think of it in terms of it's not going to replace any of these existing tools. It just potentially could add to them, right? And as I had in my other slide too, just wanted to be perfectly clear. Like I don't have a dog in this fight, right? I am not a employee of a genetics company. I will not make any money off of any genetically modified pig that does come to market. I don't even know if I use any of them on my farm. But I think the technology warrants a very close look by those of us in the industry to decide if it's something we want to use or not. So I kind of break this down into four different categories that need to be addressed as part of this topic. It's a lot of diverse areas that come into play here. So first we have the science. What is possible. The gene editing does not provide any shortcuts here. We still have to do the basic science to understand what genes are responsible for what phenotypes, what kind of modifications would you have to make in order to get a desirable phenotype. That work continues to be important and will be essential to identify targets that gene editing could be used to modify. Okay? Then the regulation piece of that. Somebody's got to create the rules that the game gets played by. And every country has their own set of rules. What we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years here is that countries are going through and modifying their rules. A lot of the rules around genetic modification were developed decades ago in response to GMOs. And now most countries are reevaluating those rules and deciding where does gene editing fit in this, and we'll talk more about that. Then you've got the producers, right? Those of us who would ultimately use the product. We're making a business decision, right? Again, we're going to look at it. We're going to say, okay, I've got this problem. This product can potentially help me with that problem. Is it worth the investment? And is there going to be any impact, any other impacts to the industry by using this? Could it affect export markets, right? That's where it ties in with the regulation piece. Those are important questions, and we'll touch on that. And then at the end of the day, somebody's got to buy our pigs and eat a pork chop, right? And so will consumers buy gene-edited pork? And we'll get into a discussion about that as well. Okay, so an overview of the science. I guess first off, raise of hands, how many people feel like they're fairly comfortable with what gene editing is? Okay, maybe a little over half. Okay, so I'm going to give you the real basic overview here, just so we're all kind of starting from the same point. So comparing gene editing to GMOs, this is a source of a lot of confusion for folks. Some people just kind of lump them all together, but there is an important distinction, and that's what I want to illustrate to you here. So for gene editing, generally when people say gene editing, they're referring to making a very precise change within the animal's own DNA. Okay? You're not adding anything. You're making a slight tweak to a gene, you're modifying a few base pairs, you're making a deletion, something like that. You're inactivating a gene maybe. So potentially it speeds up what conventional breeding could do. It just happens a lot faster. Okay? We're not talking about GMOs. When people talk about genetically modified organisms, GMO, they're generally referring to transgenic changes. And what is a transgenic change? That's taking a gene from one species and putting it into another. So you take a bacterial gene, you stick it into a plant, and now that plant is toxic to some insects, right? Those are the GMOs that we're all familiar with. So no foreign DNA is kind of the key point there, because that's what a lot of when it comes down to it, that's what a lot of the regulations are based on. Did you add foreign DNA in, or is it all just what would be considered the natural DNA that was already there? So that's an important distinction. What's really innovating, I say genetic engineering in your garage. Well, I mean, it's literally possible. You can go on the internet now and buy a kit to gene edit bacteria in your house if you want to, right? That's one of the things I want to emphasize. That's what's, not only is this technology innovative, it's very accessible, right? It doesn't mean you can go to the grocery store and get everything you need to gene edit and go do it back home. But compared to other genetic technologies, because we've had the ability to modify DNA for decades, right? But a lot of those technologies were cumbersome, not a high success rate. There was a little more random noise in the process. So one of the huge innovations and one of the things that has really changed the landscape with gene editing is that it's very straightforward and it works in almost everything. Okay, so the basic steps are right here. First, again, you have to know what gene controls the trait you're trying to change. If you can identify that, then you can target that to directly modify only that gene of interest. Make a deletion. You can make a epitope change, whatever you want to do, and then you raise the animal and confirm that the trait actually breeds true. And also, you want to check for off-target changes, and that again, that's one of the things where gene editing has become much more precise than previously used technologies, and so there is a much lower rate of off-target changes that happen. Okay, so this all started as a curiosity in bacteria, and I actually remember back when I was in grad school, there were some discussions about CRISPR, which is just an acronym for clustered repeating sequences that are remnants in bacteria of past infections with phages. And it essentially functions as a rudimentary immune system for bacteria. That's how these CRISPR sequences were originally identified. So the real innovation came later in 2012. Two researchers figured out how to combine these CRISPR sequences with this Cas9 protein that could cut DNA. And by combining them together, now you had a way to directly target a precise piece of DNA, cut it, and make modifications. Okay? So one of the things that also illustrates how impactful this technology has been, you see 2012, the tool was developed. Only 8 years later, they awarded those researchers a Nobel Prize. So for those of you who aren't hardcore science nerds, for many Nobel Prizes, they're awarded decades after the original research because it takes that long for the true impact of and innovation of that research to come to life. In this case, it only took 8 years. That's how it just took the entire scientific community by storm. So, but you'll see another thing that happened in 2020 though was the FDA approved the first gene-edited pig. So how many people knew that the FDA had already approved a gene-edited pig back in 2020? Hands? Yeah, a few. But it very much flew under the radar. Most people aren't even aware that this gal-safe pig exists. Well, what is that? It came out of work that folks who are working on modifying the pig to make it more suitable for xenotransplantation, right? One of the biggest factors with immune rejection is this alpha-gal sugar. So they one of the first steps they did on working on these pigs was to remove that. Well, as a side benefit of that, now you have a pig that folks who have the meat allergy to this alpha-gal sugar, they can eat this pork now and not have a reaction to it, right? So, I mean, go Google it. You can buy it online. I think it's very limited because there's a lot of people out there. This is like the only meat they can eat, and so there are a very small number of people farms actually raising it because it's a very niche market, right? But it didn't really make any waves, and most people have never even heard about it because it's just a small niche of consumers, and those consumers are highly motivated to seek out that product because they can't eat regular pork. Okay, 2022, FDA approved the slick cattle. So now this was a case of where some tropical breeds of cattle have a naturally occurring mutation that makes them more heat resistant. It gives their coat kind of a slick appearance, which is where the name comes from. So researchers took that naturally occurring mutation, put it into Angus, and voila, now you have heat resistant Angus. So that was approved in 2022 by the FDA. China has approved the first gene-edited wheat in 2024. India approved a gene-edited rice. And of course, in 2025, I think most people are aware that the PRRS-resistant pig was approved by the FDA. Now, more recently this year, Canada has now approved the PRRS-resistant pig. And in my mind, even more shocking and impactful is just in the last couple weeks, the European Union has adopted what they call new genetic technology. NGT is just a way to distinguish it from GMOs. They've approved rules for gene-edited plants. A lot of people thought that would never happen, right? Europe has been very anti-GMO since the advent of GMOs, but Europe, like many other countries, has come around to the idea that gene editing is different and should be treated differently. So no rules in place in the EU on animals yet, but plants are usually the first step most countries take, and so that's great to see. So handful of things commercialized, but there's a lot in the pipeline right now. So talking about plants have led the way on gene editing. We already mentioned the rice and wheat. Here in the U.S., mustard greens, blackberries are on the market. Soon to have non-browning bananas, which have already been rolled out in several other countries. And Japan has also improved a tomato that technically is a GMO and waxy corn. And you'll note that a lot of these first products to market, they have direct benefits to consumers. Right, and that's intentional because that they're hoping that will encourage consumers to buy the products because there is a direct benefit to them that's very clear. And there are hundreds of gene-edited plants in the pipeline heading towards market. And so now it's also reaching the barn. Now animals are coming along behind the plants. So we talked about the pig and the slick cattle. There's also some fish. Japan and Brazil have both approved some sea bream and tilapia that have been modified to grow faster. And there's more stuff coming down the pike. As you can imagine, a lot of folks are very interested in bird flu resistant chickens right now. And so there's a lot of work going on with that. End to male chick culling. So when you're raising layers, you end up with all these male chicks that you don't have a use for, and right now most of them get ground up and recycled. Some folks in Australia are working on using gene editing to increase the chances of female chicks being born instead of males, and so those males don't end up having to be destroyed. And hornless dairy cattle, some of that work's been going on in California. Okay. So one important point I want to make, nobody is claiming that gene editing is going to replace traditional breeding, right? In many ways, it can work alongside it and complement existing conventional breeding strategies. And that's sometimes I hear the argument framed as, well, it's an either or thing. Like, either we should be breeding for disease resistance or disease resilience, or we should be doing it with gene editing. In my mind, it's like, well, we should be doing all of these things, right? With the challenges we have to face, we should be throwing everything we can at it. And so I don't really buy into the argument that we have to pick one or the other. Why can't we do all? All right, so PRRS-resistant pig. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because I think what's most important is the technology platform. That's what we should really be having the discussion about, not individual products of that platform, but the platform as a whole. Do we, as the swine industry, want to use this technology? Okay? So in many ways, I want you to just completely forget about this product, but it's also kind of the elephant in the room too, right? That's what's getting the conversation the attention that it is at this point. And this is always the way it is, right? The first product to market, which, as I've told you, this technically isn't the first product to market, it's the second, but the first product that has the potential to be widely adopted is always going to be the test case, right? How this goes and the result that we get from this product going through the regulatory process, potentially going to market, that is going to be the test case for how everything else behind that gets treated, right? If crashes and burns, not a lot of people are going to want to make additional investments in the technology. If it is allowed to come to market, then how it does will kind of set the tone going forward. Why the purge-resistant pig is the first thing to market? Well, I mean, I think if we took a poll and people got to pick their least favorite disease, PRRS is going to win that most of the time. And so that's why it was picked, but also because scientists figured out that if you could delete a part of a cell receptor that the PRRS virus binds to infect cells, those cells can't be infected anymore. So it was that combination of two things, a major problem that needed to be addressed and a viable scientific solution to that problem. Okay, so let's talk a little more about regulation. This is essentially what it boils down to and what the argument is in how different countries choose to regulate genetic technology. Either they're regulating the product or the process. Okay? Historically, the process is what got regulated. If you used a process that modified the DNA, then this is how it's going to be regulated. And some people have chosen to lump gene editing in the same as transgenically modified GMOs. That is where things really get bogged down. Because they are, as I've hopefully illustrated to you, they are very different and have different outcomes to that. Most countries are coming around to the idea of a product regulation, regulating based on what kind of change was made. Is the change, does it already exist in nature? Like we talked about with the slick cattle, you have a different breed that had this naturally occurring mutation, you move it into another one. Many countries have chosen to not have any additional regulation on that because it's essentially treated as a conventionally bred animal. And that seems to be the way a lot of countries are going. Here in the U.S., the FDA kind of has a hybrid approach that's somewhere in between these two. But why this is important is because it's critical that there be regulatory approval, right? Consumers, and we'll get into consumers a little bit, but consumers have told us that that means a lot to them to know that it has approval by these regulatory bodies. But at the same time, if the regulation is overly burdensome, it has a chilling effect on the technology, right? It's like, the PRRS-resistant pig, it's taken years to get through the regulatory process. Only so many companies have the resources and time to shepherd something through that many years of regulation, not knowing if they're even going to have a product to sell at the end of the day, right? So there has to be a balance. So for the PRRS-resistant pig, this is what the regulatory scorecard looks like right now. Approved in the USDA in Canada. Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, the Dominican Republic have all essentially proved it either as treat it the same as conventional or have essentially said doesn't require any additional regulatory approval. Japan, China, South Korea are all pending. It's suspected that it will probably get approval in those countries. But right now, Mexico is the biggest hurdle, right? Shouldn't be any surprise to anyone. I think everybody probably heard about the big kerfluffle last year when Mexico said, we aren't going to take GMO corn anymore, right? And that became a huge trade dispute. It eventually got resolved through the USMCA, but it doesn't really create a pathway for a genetically modified pig or a gene-edited pig. So there's essentially no path forward in Mexico at this point. Now, I was in Mexico last year to talk to a meeting of producers, and I can tell you my take from that was they've got a lot of other problems that they're trying to address, and gene editing is not high on their priority list. That may change, and part of the reason I was down there is to just try to make sure it was on their radar at least. But this is the biggest hurdle right now for commercialization, because obviously Mexico is a huge market for us, and it's hard to see it going forward without them on board. Okay, so how can we learn from past failures? How many people have heard of the Aqua Bounty salmon? Anybody? Few? Yeah, there's a few. So Aqua Bounty salmon was, okay, it's a GMO, not gene edited. So they took some genes from other fish species, put them into the salmon to make them grow faster. Very, very decades-long regulatory process, because again, first product to market is always going to be the hardest. And you know, they eventually got there though. It came to market. I spoke with some folks from Aqua Bounty, and they had customers that loved it and were buying it, but at the end of the day, it was too much over too long a period of time, and they eventually shut down in 2024. But I don't want the lesson to this be that like biotech is bad and you know, genetically modified products are always going to fail. It's more about what kind of changes were made and how do you talk to consumers about that, right? And I think it's a very different story to tell with a gene-edited product as opposed to a transgenic. So all of this is boiling down to one question for us producers: Do we have or want the option to raise gene-edited pigs? And as I said before, we make a business decision about this for our farms, right? So we want to know what's the return on investment. Will this pay for itself? If I invest in this, am I going to see a return on it? So that's important. But also market access, right? These are the things that I've heard from producers over and over again as I've talked to them about this. Are any packers going to buy my pigs? Well, I think a lot of the packers have been very clear that they aren't that interested in trying to segregate gene-edited and non-gene-edited pigs, right? And it gets even harder when you consider that all the different parts that those pigs get broken down to are going into lots of different places that may have lots of different regulatory rules in place. So that kind of becomes a hurdle too. And then supply and price. One of the things that most producers quickly jump to is, okay, if PRRS isn't killing pigs anymore, we're going to have way too many pigs, right? And certainly that's a concern as well. For the case of the PRRS-resistant pig that has been approved to this point, it's recessive, so it's got to be bred in from both sides. So that itself means it's going to take a certain amount of time before it can get widespread enough to have that kind of impact. So everybody knows this. Pork's a global business, and we have to think globally when we're talking about introducing a new technology. So what do the economists say about this? So Dr. Jason Lusk published a paper last year, which, full disclosure, the study was funded by PIC, but If you know Dr. Lusk, which if you don't, look him up. He's one of the leading thinkers on genetically modified foods and the economics around that. Currently serves as the dean of the College of Ag at Oklahoma State. Great guy. He ran an analysis of what having PRRS-resistant pigs could look like from an economic standpoint. So the scenario that he laid out in his paper was 70% adoption over a 12-year period. So pork production, he forecasted, would increase by 7% in the U.S. Pork prices would fall because of this increased supply. But profitability could increase in countries that adopt the PRRS-resistant pig and fall in non-adopting countries. Well, how does that make sense? Well, the math is that, and again, this is his economic projection, decreases in costs and increases in productivity would offset lower prices. So prices may be lower, but you're going to have more pigs to sell. It could balance out. Is this really what's going to happen? We obviously have no idea, but this is a really smart economist who took a look at it, and this is what he came up with. Okay, so the consumer piece, right? At the end of the day, somebody's got to buy this. So we have, first I'm going to show you two studies where the consumer was presented with what the potential benefit to them would be, okay? So one was funded by PIC, again, full disclosure, 8 countries, over 5,000 people. What they found in all of the countries that they looked at, that there was an above average likelihood of purchase, and antibiotic reduction, antibiotic use reduction was the top motivator in all countries, okay? So now you say, well, PIC funded that one, can we really trust it? So here's another study that was fully independent by FMI and the Center for Food Integrity. They did their own study, and they found that over 70% of people were satisfied with purchasing gene-edited pork potentially when the benefits were disclosed. They found FDA approval was added a lot of reassurance to consumers. And Charlie Arnott runs the Center for Food Integrity. Great guy, great communicator. Look up Charlie's work, he's awesome. I had to include a quote here from him. Science is always essential, but it's never sufficient. It's one of the lessons that all of us need to learn, is that you can't convince consumers about technology by trying to explain the science to them. You have to meet them where they're at and explain how it matches with their value system, how it solves problems that they care about, okay? So in total of these first two studies, vast majority of people are open to buying pork from gene-edited animals when they're framed by the benefits. How does this benefit things that they care about? If you explain to them that it can help reduce the use of antibiotics, consumers have told us that's something they care a lot about, and so they're much more willing to consider it when it's framed that way. But what does it look like when you don't lead with the benefits? So a couple more studies from last year, one commissioned by the National Pork Board, another by USMEF. The National Pork Board one was domestic. USMEF was Mexico, Canada, Japan, and China, I think. There they found, so in this case, they didn't lead with the benefits. They were just asking about acceptance of gene-edited technology in general. They maybe explained a little bit about technically what gene editing is. They got a very different response. Essentially, people were 50-50 on it. So what's the takeaway from this? It's how you talk to consumers about technology really matters and has a huge impact on their willingness to buy products. So that I think is the biggest takeaway right now. And kind of boiling all this down, what drives acceptance? Clear personal benefit is number one every single time. You have to figure out how to frame it in a way that a consumer cares about it. Fewer sick animals, fewer antibiotics. Transparency is critically important for this. Consumers don't want to be blindsided. And that's one of the biggest lessons we can learn from GMO crops, right? Is that GMO crops were sold to producers. Here is a tool that will solve this problem for you. Producers did the math. They made a business decision. Yep, I think this is going to help me on my farm. I'm going to use the technology. This was several decades ago. Nobody bothered to explain to consumers why this was a good idea. And we're still dealing with the backlash from that, right? Because consumers felt like they were blindsided. They're like, hey, wait a minute. Why, nobody told us you were going to be genetically modifying these plants, and why did you do that? And so, that's why the whole GMO label still, has negative connotations, because of that. Well, also because of the stupid butterfly that they slap on everything now for the non-GMO project. Don't get me started on that. I mean, that one of the greatest scams in the history of the world, right? Blackmail these companies to slap your label on there to prove that it doesn't have something, right? So anyway, we're getting sidetracked. But what drives rejection, right? Getting lumped in with GMO. GMO is a bad word to most consumers. Low awareness. Most, we had about 50% of the people in this room had heard about, some of this technology. Most consumers have heard nothing about it, right? They're coming from zero. And the response to modified plants versus modified animals is a little bit different. Plants seem to be a little easier to accept than animals at this point, but I think as more and more of these gene-edited plants become commonplace on shelves, that's going to pave the way for animals, I would expect. Okay, so I'm kind of hammering home on this, but it is that important. Here's two examples of how to say the same thing in very different ways. So don't say disease-resistant pigs let producers be more profitable, right? That's true. That is a great benefit to us. Consumers absolutely do not care about that whatsoever, right? If anything, it's a negative, right? We're supposed to be farmers who are just producing food out of the goodness of our hearts. If we actually make a profit doing it, we're evil corporate farmers, right? So like that's not an argument that win over any consumers. But if instead you say disease-resistant pigs don't get sick, so they need fewer antibiotics, now that's addressing something that they do care about. And the response we get in how we communicate it is very, very different, because consumers are making an emotional decision about their food. We're making a business decision on our farms. Consumers are making an emotional decision. Okay, so benefits, lead with the benefits, not the science. Gene edited, better than GMOs. Precision breeding is kind of the regulatory term of art that's being used now, and I think it's a good term. It ties it in, right, with the breeding that we've always done. We can be even more precise with how we do it. Okay, but if we as the pork industry want to have this tool, this technology platform available, we have to be the ones who are willing to tell the story, right? The regulators aren't going to be the ones that do it. The geneticists are not going to be the ones that do it. We have to do this. We have to be willing to work for this if it's a tool that we want in our toolbox. Real briefly, a couple years ago, I chaired a task force for the National Pork Board on gene editing. We learned a lot of these things that we've talked about today. At that time, the task force decided the most important thing to do was to try to educate producers about it, which is exactly what I'm trying to do today, is just give you the information that you need to make your own decision about this and decide if it's something that you think the industry should use or not. So go to the Pork Checkoff, just search for Pork Checkoff gene editing, and that'll get you to their site where they have some educational materials if you want to learn more than what I've told you today. So where have I ended up through this 8-year journey through gene editing? So again, my take on this, potentially another tool in the toolbox. The question is, do we want it in there or not? Global markets make the regulatory picture very complicated, right? It doesn't necessarily even matter that the FDA has approved it. Obviously, we need that to utilize it here in the United States, but our pigs go all over the world, and so what other countries think is just as important. The PRRS-resistant pig is the test case, right? There are so many other things that could come behind this, right? Will I ever use a PRRS-resistant pig on my farm? I don't know. If somebody was selling me a rotavirus-resistant pig, I would buy that today, right? But we all have challenges on our farms, and when we try to manage them with the tools we have available, and sometimes we really wish we had another tool we could grab. Consumer acceptance is going to be critically important at the end of the day, right? And there's still a lot of confusion over who should be taking the lead in talking to consumers about this, right? The retailers don't sound like they're very excited to be the ones to do that, but they need to be able to answer questions when they're asked. So how if we want to use this, we need to empower other people in our value chain to be able to talk about it as well. And at the end of the day, gene-edited products are coming to market. They've already come to market, and they're going to continue to come to market with or without us. If we choose to sit this one out, other countries are going to move ahead with it. Other industries are moving ahead with it. So we have to make our own decision. Okay, so before one last thought I want to leave you with, the barn on here, as I've thought about this over the years, I keep coming back to this barn. So this is an old brick barn that's still standing on our farm. Back in the day, many, many years ago, when I was a kid, we farrowed hogs in here. Initially, it's solid floor. We just had the sows in there, the little door on the side. We had to let them out twice a day to feed and water them. I'm sure a lot of you had very similar setups back in the day. Eventually, we adopted new technology. We had raised farrowing crates in there. So then, as a kid, my job went from trying to convince a sow to go outside in the middle of winter to eat and drink to scraping underneath these cool new raised farrowing crates that had about 15 inches between the front of the crate and the wall of the barn, and had to stand on my head with the scraper there, push it all to the center alleyway and out the barn. And we thought it was the greatest thing ever, right? Because it was a new technology that we had adopted, and it was better than what we were using before. Well, obviously it's been many, many years since we farrowed any pigs in this barn because we adopted even newer technologies. But I see a lot of parallels here with barn technology, right? Because we adopted a lot of changes in how we house animals over the years, and we're still, to this day, we're still fighting for our right to use these technologies. And so in my mind, it's the same kind of question here. So now there's a new genetic technology, and we have to decide, do we as an industry want to fight for the ability to use this to help solve some of our production challenges? So that's kind of where we're at. Be happy to take any questions, comments, expressions of outrage, whatever you've got. I'm all ears. Thank you.
Any questions for Mike?
Got one in the back over there.
Wait for the microphone. We need it for the recording.
In your understanding, looking out at the future of this technology, what's its future potential? Have you heard about any of the diseases maybe they're working on right now, or what's 5, 10, 20 years look like?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of that is going to depend on what the most pressing issue facing a particular industry in a particular country, right? Like there's a lot of scientists in China who are feverishly working on an ASF resistant pig right now, right? Which makes sense. So I think we're going to see a lot of things like that. We're going to see, you talk about the potential for pigs that are more heat tolerant, right? There's a fair amount of interest in that. I had talking with one researcher. He was like, well, there's no reason why we couldn't have pigs that are capable of synthesizing their own lysine and stuff like that. So I mean, so literally the possibilities are endless at this point, and are really only limited by our understanding of what genes are responsible for what phenotypes. But a lot of these ideas are still they're just ideas. That's all they are at this point. A lot of people are kind of on the sidelines and waiting to see where the dust settles on this before they start investing serious resources in it. So that's kind of where things are at. Scientists are still full speed ahead, right? Figuring out what kind of beneficial changes could be made, but nobody's really looking at moving them towards market until they see, where we end up as an industry, as consumers, on this topic.
I think you hit early on one of the keys to this is you got to show the consumer what the benefit is to them. I saw yesterday that in Memphis there was a gene-edited human now. They edited the gene to knock out the sickle cell trait in a human. So that's a pretty easy example of how it benefits them. Just one comment, I think in today's age in general, there's a giant mistrust of all things food and agriculture, unfortunately. And I don't know how we overcome that. And this just seems to me another brick in that wall that leads to more distrust of food and agriculture if we can't explain to them what the benefit is to them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that's a good example. I did have that on one of my slides. I didn't call it out necessarily, but yeah, that sickle cell anemia treatment has been approved, which is going to, I think, do a lot of good for consumer acceptance of the technology, right? Because it's hard to argue with that, right? Like, we can use gene editing to cure what is otherwise an incurable disease. Nobody's going to argue against that. And one thing, talking about consumers and what consumers tell us and stuff, I think one thing you have to have in the back of your mind is that consumers have told us a lot of things over the years, and in most cases, they still go to the store and buy the cheapest thing that's available, right? So we kind of have to keep that in mind too at the end of the day. It's like, some people say the customer is always right, and my response to that is, yeah, but most customers are idiots too. So we always need to keep that in mind. We're constantly going to get pushback against any new technology we use, because people think we're all still old MacDonald on the farm back in the 1950s with a couple chickens and a couple pigs and a couple cows, and we can't break out of that cultural lock on that era of farming.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to merge the first presentation with this one, and I know most of us live and breathe this every single day, but this is our day job. When we go home, go to the grocery store, go to our kids' school, all the other connections that we have just outside of this industry ourselves, how are you telling our story outside of just the day-to-day people that we talk to? So I think I challenge, and I'm trying to do that myself, is I challenge us as an industry, individually, professionally, personally. How do we expand on telling our story to, merge on, the innovation side, as well as this whole new story of gene editing and things that we need to address with the consumer?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's why I've volunteered my time over the last 8 years to run around to meetings and talk to folks about this, is just because I feel like our industry has a history of innovation, right? That's why we've been able to maintain our position as the world leader in swine production. And if we want to maintain that lead, I think we need to continue to innovate. And And I don't see any reason, again, this is my personal opinion, why stop now? I mean, why go the route of Europe and just like say, okay, we're going to freeze everything the way it is right now and we're not going to change anything beyond that? You know, that's not very exciting to me going forward. So I really appreciate your time and attention on this, and hopefully have given you something to think about and talk about. Thank you.
So I do want, you're a lot taller than I am. I do want to acknowledge Mike for the lecture today. As I mentioned, this is part of the Lauren Christian Science and Management and Genetics lectureship that we do here with Iowa Swine Day. And part of the legacy that Lauren left with the Animal Science Department was to do this once a year. And so we do want to present Mike with a plaque to acknowledge his participation today. And yeah. Here's the box. So with that, I think that was a great opportunity for us to take the two presentations this morning, just was mentioned here a moment ago, of thinking about how we accept change, how we're going to move forward with changes that continue to happen within our industry, and then how do we help others accept that change, particularly when we think about the consumer.